I never imagined that the people I trusted most would be the ones to take everything from me. One morning, I left my house believing my life was still mine. By the time I returned, the locks had been changed, my belongings were moved, and my own family was standing inside my home like they owned it. There were no explanations, no apologies, only cold confidence and silence where love used to be. In that moment, I realized trust can be shattered in seconds, and when it is, the damage runs far deeper than walls and keys. This is the story of how I lost my home and found my strength. Before we dive into today's story, let us know where you're watching from. And as you watch, don't just sit back, be part of the experience. If a moment grabs your attention, whether it's powerful, unexpected, or deeply moving, drop a comment with the timestamp of that scene and share your thoughts. Your reactions bring the story to life, and we love seeing which moments resonate with you the most. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, grab a coffee or tea, settle in, and let's begin. My name is Margaret Wilson, and at 61, I believed I had finally earned a quiet life. I had spent more than 3 decades in the same weathered 2-story house in Charleston, South Carolina, close enough to the coast that the air always carried a faint trace of salt. The porch boards creaked when I stepped outside in the mornings, and the palm trees in the yard leaned gently toward the sea, as if they were listening for its call. Every corner of that house held memories of my late husband, his old fishing hat on the hook by the door, the dent in the kitchen counter where he once dropped a toolbox, the soft groove in the armchair where he used to sit each evening. After he passed, the house became my anchor. It was where I felt safe, where I felt grounded, and where I believed my family would always gather. I had one child, my son Daniel. From the day he was born, I made him my priority. When he struggled, I helped. When he needed support, I gave it. That was what mothers did, or at least that was what I had always believed. Over the years, I helped him with car payments, covered a few credit card balances when things got tight, and even assisted with part of his college tuition. None of it felt like a burden at the time. It felt like love. Daniel married Rebecca 8 years ago. She was confident, polished, and practical in a way I never had been. She worked in management, dressed sharply, and spoke with the kind of certainty that made people listen. At first, I admired her. She seemed organized, driven, and determined to build a stable life with my son. Together, they gave me my greatest joy, my grandson. He was the light of my world. Every visit, every laugh, every messy art project left on my kitchen table reminded me why I had worked so hard all those years. I wanted to be the grandmother who showed up, who helped when needed, who never let her family fall. Financially, I was comfortable but careful. My parents had left me a modest inheritance, and I had saved diligently during my working years as an administrative assistant. I was not wealthy, but I had enough to live peacefully and support my family when necessary. I never imagined that money could become a source of tension. In my mind, family was built on trust. Daniel had always relied on me more than he liked to admit. He was kind-hearted, but he avoided responsibility when things became difficult. Rebecca, on the other hand, liked control. She handled their finances, organized their schedules, and made most of the decisions. I told myself that every marriage had its balance, and this was simply theirs. Occasionally, Rebecca would make small comments about planning for the future. She would mention how complicated it could be for older people to manage large financial matters, or how families functioned better when assets were streamlined. Daniel would nod along, adding that he only wanted to make things easier for me as I aged. I heard the concern in their voices, not pressure. So I brushed it off. I had spent my life putting others first. Saying no felt unnatural to me. I preferred peace to confrontation and silence to conflict. If something felt uncomfortable, I convinced myself it was temporary. Each morning, I sat on my porch with my coffee, watching the sunlight stretch across the yard. The house felt steady. My life felt predictable. I believed I was surrounded by people who cared about me, people who would protect me the way I had always protected them. Looking back, I realized how deeply I wanted that to be true. There were signs, of course, subtle ones, a certain tone when finances came up, a look exchanged between Daniel and Rebecca when I offered help, conversations that felt rehearsed, even if I could not explain why. Still, I trusted them. I trusted the family I had built. At 61, I thought my greatest challenges were behind me. I had no idea that everything I believed about loyalty, love, and security was about to be tested. If you're still watching and already sensing that something feels off beneath the surface, comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. What looks peaceful now may not stay that way for long. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. In the weeks after my 61st birthday, life in Charleston still looked peaceful from the outside. The ocean breeze drifted through my open windows, and the familiar rhythm of my mornings remained unchanged. Coffee on the porch, a short walk down the street, then back inside to the quiet comfort of my home. Yet beneath that calm surface, something in my family dynamics had begun to shift. Rebecca started talking more often about finances. At first, it sounded harmless. She would mention how complicated money management could become as people got older, or how families functioned better when things were organized early. Her tone was polite, even warm, but the subject kept returning to the same place: ownership, control, planning for the future. Daniel followed her lead. My son, who once talked about his job, his hobbies, and my grandson's school projects, now seemed more interested in paperwork. He asked questions about my accounts, my property, and the inheritance I had received from my parents. He framed everything as concern, as if he were simply trying to protect me from stress. I told myself this was what responsible adults did. They planned ahead. Still, a quiet discomfort settled in my chest whenever the topic came up. I could not explain it, but something about their focus on my finances felt different from the care I had known before. Their questions no longer felt curious. They felt calculated. One afternoon, I met my longtime friend Eleanor for lunch at a small cafe near the marina. We had known each other since my husband was still alive, and she had seen every chapter of my life unfold. As we sat by the window watching the boats drift in and out of the harbor, I finally shared what had been weighing on my mind. Eleanor listened carefully, her expression thoughtful. She did not interrupt. When I finished, she gently suggested something I had never seriously considered before: a trust. She explained that placing my assets into a legal trust could protect my property and ensure that my wishes were followed, no matter what pressures arose later. It was not about distrusting my family, she said. It was about protecting myself. Her words stayed with me long after we paid the bill and went our separate ways. That night, I walked through my house, touching the familiar surfaces that had carried me through decades of marriage, motherhood, and loss. The framed photographs, the worn stair railing, the small garden I had planted with my husband years ago. Everything in that space told the story of my life. I realized how much of myself was tied to this home and to the security it represented. For the first time, I allowed myself to ask a difficult question: what would happen if my good intentions were not enough? I did not accuse Daniel or Rebecca of anything. I did not confront them. Instead, I chose silence and reflection. Over the next few days, I gathered my financial records, reviewed my inheritance documents, and scheduled a meeting with an estate attorney recommended by Eleanor. The law office was quiet, professional, and reassuring. The attorney explained the process in clear terms. A trust would allow me to maintain control over my assets while protecting them from unwanted interference. My house, my savings, and my inheritance could remain secure, managed according to my instructions. Signing the paperwork felt strange. I was not used to making decisions that placed boundaries between me and my family. Yet as the final documents were prepared, I felt a surprising sense of relief. It was not distrust that guided me. It was responsibility. I told myself this was simply a precaution. When I returned home that evening, the sky glowed orange over the water. My porch looked exactly as it always had, peaceful and unchanged. I sat down with my coffee and watched the sunset, convinced that nothing in my life had truly shifted. I believed I had made a quiet, sensible choice that no one needed to know about. I had no idea that by protecting myself, I had unknowingly set the stage for a confrontation that would change everything. If you're starting to notice the warning signs and feel the tension building, comment number 2 below so I know you're paying attention. The next chapter reveals a shocking change no one expected. Let's continue. The morning after I finalized the trust, I left for my routine medical appointment the same way I always did. I locked the front door, checked my purse, and walked down the porch steps with the quiet confidence of someone who believed her world was still in order. The sky was pale blue, the air warm, and the street looked unchanged. Nothing warned me that I was about to lose something I had protected for over 30 years. When I returned home a few hours later, the first thing I noticed was how stiff the front door felt in my hand. The key did not slide in smoothly. I tried again, slower this time, my fingers tightening around the metal. The lock resisted, as if it no longer recognized me. A thin line of unease crept up my spine. After a few seconds of struggling, the door finally opened. Inside, the house felt wrong. The air smelled different, heavy with unfamiliar perfume. A pair of shoes I did not own sat by the entrance. A large handbag rested on the hall table where my mail usually went. In the living room, decorative pillows in colors I had never chosen were arranged neatly on the couch. My framed photographs had been shifted to the side, replaced by modern prints that meant nothing to me. My home, the place where I had built a life, suddenly felt like someone else's space. I moved slowly through the rooms, my heart pounding harder with each step. My kitchen counter held containers of food I had not cooked. Rebecca's coat hung on the chair where my husband used to leave his jacket. Even the guest room door was open, revealing suitcases stacked against the wall. That was when Rebecca appeared. She stood in the hallway, calm and composed, as if this were the most natural arrangement in the world. Her posture was confident, her expression unreadable. She told me, in a steady voice, that Daniel had agreed they could move in. She said it as a statement, not a question, as though my opinion was no longer required. I waited for my son to step forward and explain. Daniel lingered behind her, avoiding my eyes. He shifted his weight, stared at the floor, and said nothing that resembled an apology. His silence felt louder than any argument. It told me everything I needed to know about where his loyalty had gone. The walls of the house seemed to close in around me. This was the home where I had celebrated birthdays, mourned losses, and watched my child grow. Every scratch on the floor and every faded photo held a story I had lived. Yet in that moment, I felt like a stranger standing in someone else's property. I tried to keep my voice steady. I did not raise it. I did not accuse. I asked simple questions that deserved simple answers. Why had they not spoken to me first? Why had the locks been changed? Why did they believe this was acceptable? Rebecca's response was calm, almost rehearsed. She spoke about convenience, about helping me, about making things easier as I aged. Daniel remained silent, offering no resistance, no defense, no comfort. The weight of their entitlement pressed against my chest. I realized then that this was not confusion or miscommunication. It was a decision, a deliberate one. They had not asked for my permission because they believed they no longer needed it. My hands trembled slightly as I looked around the room. The familiar objects that once brought me comfort now felt like evidence of how easily my place in my own home had been erased. I was not angry yet. I was stunned, disoriented by how quickly everything had changed. So I did the only thing I could. I gathered my purse, took one last look at the walls that had sheltered me for decades, and walked back out the front door. The porch boards creaked beneath my feet, just as they always had, but the sound no longer felt reassuring. It felt hollow. As I stood in the driveway, the reality settled in. The people I trusted most had taken something that was never theirs to claim, and I knew with painful clarity that my life was no longer moving forward in the same direction it had just that morning. If what just happened surprised you and made you question everything, comment number 3 to let me know you're still here. Things are about to get even more intense. Now, let's move on to chapter 4. I spent the night on Eleanor's couch, staring at the ceiling and listening to the soft ticking of her kitchen clock. My body felt heavy, as if the shock had settled into my bones. I kept replaying the moment I walked back into my house and realized it was no longer mine. I told myself there had to be an explanation, something I had misunderstood. Daniel was my son. He would not truly betray me. Not like that. By morning, my emotions had shifted from disbelief to quiet determination. I did not want to fight. I did not want arguments or raised voices. I wanted clarity, respect, and the simple courtesy of being treated like the owner of my own life. So I reached out to Daniel and asked if we could talk. We met at a small cafe a few blocks from the marina. The smell of coffee and baked bread filled the air, but it did nothing to calm the tightness in my chest. Daniel arrived with Rebecca, and the way they sat side by side, already united, told me more than any words could. I spoke carefully. I explained how hurt I felt, how confused I was by their decision to move into my home without asking. I reminded them that the house was not just a building to me. It was my history, my stability, and the place where I had raised my child. Rebecca responded with a composed smile. She spoke about convenience, about how it made sense for everyone to be under one roof, about how she and Daniel were simply trying to help me. Her tone was smooth, confident, and strangely distant, as if she were speaking to a client rather than her husband's mother. Daniel barely met my eyes. I waited for him to defend me, to acknowledge that the situation was unfair. Instead, he nodded along with Rebecca's words, his silence acting as quiet approval. The absence of his support hurt more than any harsh sentence could have. I left the cafe feeling smaller than I had in years. A few days later, a letter arrived at Eleanor's house addressed to me. The envelope carried the seal of a legal office. My hands trembled as I opened it, expecting something routine. Instead, the words on the page left me breathless. Rebecca had filed a petition for financial guardianship. The document claimed that I was no longer fully capable of managing my own affairs. It suggested that my age made me vulnerable, that my judgment might be impaired, and that my assets required outside supervision. The implication was clear. She wanted control over my finances, my property, and my decisions. This was not concern. This was strategy. The room seemed to spin as I reread the letter, each sentence cutting deeper than the last. The woman who had smiled politely at me in public had been preparing to take my independence behind closed doors. The son I had supported for decades had allowed it to happen. For a brief moment, anger threatened to overwhelm me. My heart pounded and my thoughts raced with every sacrifice I had made for Daniel, every time I had put his needs before my own. Yet beneath that anger, something stronger began to form: clarity. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not an accident. It was a calculated attempt to control me. I contacted an attorney that same afternoon. The office was quiet and professional, filled with framed certificates and soft lighting that made the space feel secure. As I explained what had happened, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time since losing my home, I was no longer alone in the fight. The attorney confirmed what I already knew in my heart. The guardianship petition had no valid foundation. I was mentally sound, financially aware, and fully capable of making my own decisions. Rebecca's move was not about protection, it was about power. When I left the office, the air felt different, lighter. I still felt betrayed. I still felt the sting of my son's silence, but I also felt something new rising within me: strength. For years, I had believed that love meant giving without limits. Now I understood that love also meant knowing when to protect yourself. My family had tried to take more than I was willing to give, and this time, I was ready to stand my ground. If you can feel how serious this situation has become, comment number 4 below so I know you're following closely. The next chapter brings a powerful confrontation that changes everything. Let's continue. The call came 3 days after I met with my attorney. I recognized Daniel's number on the screen, but I hesitated before answering. Something in my chest tightened, as if my body already knew what was coming. When I finally picked up, his voice sounded sharper than I remembered. He did not ask how I was. He did not mention my health, my living situation, or the chaos they had caused. Instead, he went straight to the point. He had learned about the trust. Word had traveled quickly. Rebecca's voice soon followed his, tense and controlled in a way that made my stomach twist. The warmth she once pretended to show me was gone. In its place was frustration, barely contained. They spoke about paperwork, about legal barriers, about how my decision had complicated things for them. Not once did they acknowledge what they had done to me. We agreed to meet at Eleanor's house, neutral ground where I felt safe. When they arrived, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken accusations. Daniel's jaw was tight, his shoulders rigid. Rebecca walked in as if she owned the space, her confidence masking something darker beneath the surface. The familiar balance of power had shifted, and they both knew it. Daniel accused me of hiding things from him. He said I should have trusted my own son instead of involving lawyers. The words stung, but what hurt more was the assumption behind them. He believed my assets were something he was entitled to manage, as if my life belonged to him simply because I was his mother. Rebecca's composure finally cracked. She spoke about how my decision had disrupted their plans, how the trust made everything more difficult. The frustration in her voice was not about concern for me, it was about control slipping through her fingers. Listening to them, I felt something inside me settle into place. This was not about family, it was about access. For years, I had believed that my role was to support, to sacrifice, to smooth over problems before they became conflicts. I had convinced myself that my generosity was appreciated, that my presence was valued. Now, as I watched their anger rise, I realized how little my feelings had ever mattered to them. They were not upset because I was hurt. They were upset because they had lost leverage. I stayed calm. I did not argue. I did not apologize. I simply listened. Every sharp word they spoke revealed more than they intended: Daniel's resentment, Rebecca's ambition, their shared belief that my independence was an obstacle rather than a right. When Rebecca accused me of undermining their efforts to help me, I felt a quiet sense of clarity wash over me. Help did not arrive with locked doors and legal threats. Help did not remove someone from their own home. Help did not silence a mother's voice. This was control, disguised as concern. The confrontation ended without resolution. There were no heartfelt apologies, no promises to change, only distance. The air between us felt colder than ever, as if an invisible wall had risen where trust once stood. After they left, Eleanor and I sat in silence for a long moment. The house felt strangely empty, even though it had not been full to begin with. My heart ached, but it did not break. Not anymore. I had spent decades believing that loyalty meant endurance, that love meant tolerance, that being a good mother required endless patience. But in that quiet living room, I finally understood something I had ignored for far too long. Respect is not inherited. It is earned. And I was done giving it to people who only saw me as a resource. The trust I had placed in my family was gone, but in its place stood something stronger. Self-respect, awareness, and the certainty that protecting myself was not betrayal. It was survival. As the evening light faded through the windows, I knew that the relationship I once had with Daniel and Rebecca was beyond repair. The illusion had shattered, and in its place was the truth. They had shown me exactly who they were, and this time I believed them. After the confrontation at Eleanor's house, I did not cry the way I once would have. The tears stayed somewhere deep inside me, heavy but contained. What remained on the surface was something firmer, quieter, and far more focused. I finally understood that emotion would not protect me. Only action would. 2 days later, I walked into my attorney's office with a folder of documents pressed tightly against my chest. Bank statements, property records, old loan papers, and every legal notice Rebecca had sent. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh coffee, and the steady hum of the air conditioning felt oddly comforting. This was a place where rules still mattered. I explained everything: the changed locks, the forced move, the guardianship petition, the confrontation. My voice remained calm, even as I described how my own son had stood silently while his wife tried to take control of my life. The attorney listened without interruption, his expression serious but composed. When I finished, he nodded and began outlining my options. The trust, he explained, gave me the legal authority I needed to protect my assets. I could issue a formal notice demanding that Daniel and Rebecca vacate my house. I could restrict their access to my finances entirely. I could, at last, reclaim control over what was rightfully mine. There was no hesitation in my response. For years, I had avoided conflict because I believed peace required sacrifice. Now I saw the truth. Peace required boundaries. The eviction notice was prepared that afternoon. It was clear, direct, and legally binding. My home was no longer open to unauthorized occupancy, no matter who claimed entitlement. My finances were secured under the trust, beyond the reach of emotional manipulation. As we reviewed older financial records, the attorney paused over a set of documents I barely remembered signing. He pointed out subtle irregularities in the handwriting. The signatures looked like mine, but something about them was off. After a deeper review, the conclusion became impossible to ignore. Daniel had forged my signature on previous banking paperwork. The room felt suddenly smaller. My son had not only allowed his wife to threaten my independence, he had already crossed a legal line long before I realized it. The betrayal cut deeper than anything else so far. This was not passive complicity. This was active deception. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the weight of that truth settle. Memories rushed in. Every time I had trusted him with my accounts. Every time I had assumed his intentions were honest. Every time I had believed that love alone would keep us safe. I did not raise my voice. I did not break down. I simply asked what my legal options were. Forgery, the attorney explained, was a serious offense. The matter could escalate quickly if I chose to pursue it. The choice was mine. I thought about Daniel as a little boy, holding my hand as we crossed the street. I thought about the pride I felt watching him graduate. I thought about the sacrifices I made so he could have opportunities I never had. Then I thought about the locks on my door, the letter questioning my mental competence, the quiet confidence with which Rebecca had spoken about controlling my finances. Love did not erase accountability. I authorized my attorney to proceed. When I stepped back outside, the afternoon sun felt warmer than usual. The sky was bright, the air heavy with the scent of salt and summer flowers. The world looked unchanged, yet everything inside me had shifted. I was no longer the woman who believed kindness alone could protect her. I was a woman who understood the power of preparation. That evening, I sat on Eleanor's porch and watched the light fade across the horizon. My life felt uncertain, but it no longer felt out of my control. I had taken my first real step toward reclaiming my independence. Daniel and Rebecca had underestimated me. They saw a mother who would always forgive. They never expected a woman who would finally defend herself. And for the first time in a very long while, I felt steady in my own strength. If you're still watching and realizing this is no longer just a family issue, comment number 6 to show you're with me. The consequences are about to unfold. Now, let's move on to chapter 7. The days that followed my legal decisions passed in an uneasy silence. Eleanor's house, once a place of warm conversation and shared laughter, felt quieter now, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. My phone rested on the small table beside the couch, lighting up every few hours with missed calls and unread messages. I did not need to open them to know who they were from. Daniel and Rebecca had received the eviction notice. They had also learned that their access to my finances was gone. The shift in their tone was immediate. The sharp anger that once filled their voices softened into urgency, then into something closer to desperation. Their messages no longer carried accusations. Instead, they carried questions, explanations, and carefully worded apologies. They spoke about misunderstandings, about stress, about how everything had gone too far too quickly. I did not respond. For the first time in my life, silence was not avoidance. It was protection. Each unanswered call reinforced a boundary I had never been brave enough to draw before. I was no longer explaining myself. I was no longer justifying my choices. I was simply allowing the consequences of their actions to exist without interference. The balance of power had shifted. For years, Daniel and Rebecca had guided the direction of our relationship. They decided when to ask for help, how much to take, and how to frame their needs as necessities. Now, the control they once held was slipping away, and the uncertainty showed in every message they sent. Still, strength did not erase pain. At night, when the house grew quiet and my thoughts grew loud, memories crept in. I remembered Daniel's small hand wrapped around my finger as we crossed busy streets. I remembered late nights helping him study, the pride I felt watching him grow into adulthood. I remembered believing that love, given freely, would always be returned with care. Those memories did not disappear just because trust had been broken. The loneliness that followed was different from grief. It was not the sharp ache of loss, but the dull weight of disappointment. I had not only lost my sense of security, I had lost the version of my son I once believed in. And yet, beneath the sadness, there was a quiet sense of peace. No one was questioning my competence anymore. No one was asking about my accounts or my property. No one was positioning themselves between me and my own life. The pressure that had slowly built over months had finally lifted. For the first time in a long while, my choices belonged entirely to me. Eleanor noticed the change before I did. She remarked on how I seemed calmer, how my shoulders no longer carried the same tension. I smiled at the observation, knowing it was true. The absence of manipulation had created space for clarity. I spent my mornings walking along the shoreline, letting the rhythm of the waves steady my thoughts. The ocean had always reminded me that even the strongest forces moved with patience. That resilience did not require noise. The quiet was not empty, it was honest. There were moments when doubt tried to creep back in. I wondered if I had been too firm, too distant, too final. But then I remembered the locks on my door, the letter questioning my mental capacity, and the signatures that were not truly mine. Those memories grounded me in reality. Trust, once broken, could not be rebuilt with the words alone. The calls from Daniel and Rebecca eventually slowed. The messages became shorter, less frequent, as if they were slowly realizing that their influence had ended. The silence that followed felt different from the silence before. This one was not tense. It was settled. I had not won a battle. I had reclaimed my autonomy. There was no celebration, no dramatic victory, just the quiet understanding that I had chosen myself after a lifetime of choosing others. The cost was high, but the clarity it brought was worth every difficult step. Some losses do not come with closure. They come with freedom. I moved into my new apartment on a quiet street not far from the shoreline. It was smaller than the house I had lived in for decades, but it felt lighter somehow, as if the walls were not weighed down by memories or expectations. The windows faced the ocean, and in the mornings, sunlight spilled across the wooden floor in soft, peaceful patterns. For the first time in months, my home felt like a place of rest rather than resistance. The silence here was different. It was not filled with tension or unanswered questions. It was calm, honest. I began my days with a slow walk along the beach, letting the sound of the waves steady my thoughts. My life no longer revolved around managing other people's needs. I focused on my health, my routines, and the quiet things that brought me comfort. Eleanor encouraged me to join a local group for women in their 50s and 60s. Many of them had their own stories of betrayal, loss, and unexpected change. We shared coffee, laughter, and pieces of our past without judgment. Listening to them helped me understand that I was not alone in my experience. I was not weak for trusting my family. I was human. With time, I learned something I had never truly practiced before. Boundaries were not cruel. They were necessary. Loving others did not mean sacrificing myself. Protecting my independence was not selfish. It was survival. One afternoon, I received news that surprised me, but did not shock me. Rebecca had been dismissed from her job. The reason, I was told, involved misuse of company funds and questionable financial decisions. The pattern was familiar. The same behavior she had tried to hide behind concern in my life had followed her into her professional world. I did not feel satisfaction. I felt clarity. Her actions had never been about helping me. They had been about control. The difference now was that her influence over my life was gone. I no longer woke up worrying about phone calls, letters, or hidden agendas. My finances were secure. My space was my own. The constant pressure I once felt had faded into the background, replaced by a sense of quiet confidence. Some nights, I still thought about Daniel. I wondered who he had become, and how far he had drifted from the boy I raised. The sadness was there, but it no longer ruled me. I had learned that I could grieve what was lost without surrendering what remained. Each morning, as I sipped my coffee by the window and watched the tide roll in, I reminded myself of one simple truth. I had done the best I could with the love I had. Now, I was finally doing the best I could for myself. And for the first time in a long while, that was enough. If you're ready to see how this story finally ends, comment number 8 below to let me know you're still here. The final outcome may not be what you expect. Let's move on to the conclusion. When I finally stepped back into my old house, the air felt different. Not lighter, not heavier, just quiet. The legal process had taken time, but every document was now in place, every boundary clearly defined. The house was mine again, not just in memory, but in law. No one else had a claim to it. No one else held a key. The front door opened easily this time. The familiar scent of polished wood and sea air greeted me like an old friend. Rebecca's belongings were gone. The unfamiliar decorations had disappeared. My photographs were back where they belonged, lining the walls with pieces of my life. The house looked the same as it always had, yet I felt different standing inside it. There was no sense of triumph, only calm. Daniel's situation had become complicated. The investigation into the forged signatures was ongoing, and the weight of his actions could no longer be avoided. I did not follow every detail. I did not need to. What mattered was that my finances were protected, my independence restored, and my future no longer tied to anyone else's decisions. Rebecca had left Charleston not long after losing her job. There were no goodbyes, no dramatic exits, just a quiet departure, as if she understood that her influence here was finished. The town returned to its familiar rhythm, and so did my life. I walked through each room slowly, touching the surfaces I had once cleaned, painted, and cared for with my husband. The memories were still there, but they no longer felt heavy. They felt honest. This house had seen joy, loss, and now resilience. On the porch, I sat with a cup of coffee and watched the palm trees sway in the breeze. The ocean was steady in the distance, its rhythm unchanged by the events that had reshaped my world. I realized then that control had never truly belonged to anyone else. I had simply handed it away. The silence around me was not lonely. It was peaceful. I no longer waited for phone calls that never came. I no longer worried about hidden intentions or quiet manipulation. The chapter that had begun with trust and ended with betrayal was finally closed. Some relationships cannot be repaired. Some truths cannot be softened. But clarity brings its own kind of peace. As the sunlight stretched across the porch floor, I felt a quiet acceptance settle in my chest. My life was not defined by what had been taken from me, but by what I had chosen to protect. And that choice had given me back more than a house. It had given me myself. On quiet mornings, I still sit on the porch with a warm cup of coffee in my hands, watching the light stretch across the yard. The palm trees sway gently in the breeze, and the distant sound of the ocean reminds me that life keeps moving, no matter what we lose or learn along the way. I am not angry anymore. I am not bitter. What I feel now is clarity. For most of my life, I believed that being a good mother meant putting everyone else first. I thought love required endless patience, endless forgiveness, and endless sacrifice. I told myself that family bonds were unbreakable, even when respect began to fade. But love without boundaries becomes a burden. What I learned through loss is something I wish I had understood sooner. Protecting yourself is not selfish. It is necessary. Kindness does not mean surrendering your voice. Trust does not mean giving up control of your own life. I once feared that standing up for myself would make me lonely. Instead, it made me free. My world is quieter now, but it is also stronger. My choices belong to me. My home is safe. My future is my own. I no longer measure my worth by how much I give to others, but by how well I care for myself. Family, I have learned, is not defined by blood alone. It is defined by respect, honesty, and the ability to treat one another with dignity. When those things disappear, so must the illusion that everything is fine. I am 61 years old, and I finally understand something simple but powerful. It is never too late to choose yourself. The sun rises over the porch, warm and steady, and I breathe in the quiet with a sense of peace I have not felt in years. My story is not about what was taken from me. It is about what I reclaimed. My independence, my voice, my life. And that, at last, is enough. Sometimes life teaches its hardest lessons through silence, not noise. Trust, once broken, reveals what truly matters: self-respect, clarity, and the courage to protect what we have built. Strength is not found in confrontation, but in knowing when to stand firm without raising your voice. Boundaries are not walls meant to isolate us, but bridges that guide us toward healthier, more honest connections. Every ending carries a beginning within it. When we choose dignity over fear and truth over comfort, we reclaim more than what was taken from us. We reclaim ourselves. Thank you for spending this time with us and reflecting on a story about resilience, growth, and quiet strength. If this journey resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters here. Do not forget to like, follow, and subscribe for more meaningful stories that inspire reflection and empowerment.